Hello, you're listening to Democracy Watch, the News Collective's weekly news report, bringing you alternative and undercovered current affairs from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. My name is Alex DeBoer.
I'm Max Newman.
I'm Armand Rana.
And I'm Milena Carrasco. It's Thursday, June 20th at 5 o'clock p.m. We're broadcasting from UBC's Vancouver campus on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people.
On today's new show, we're going to go over some local headlines, and we have a special segment to share with you on what Vancouverites around UBC's campus think of the second reapproval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline.
But first, we have an interview with Vancouver Sun reporter Laurie Culbert. Just this week, Laurie has published 2 different articles on the sale of provincial, quote-unquote, surplus land since 2013. Reporter Alex DeBoer spoke with Laurie on the phone today to ask her about her reporting. Let's take a listen.
Over the last 6 years, BC's provincial governments have sold 164 pieces of what they deem surplus land. Under the BC Liberals and now the BC NDP, over $1 billion in revenue has been raised from these public unceded land sales, which include schools, hospitals, agricultural, and industrial lots. Reporter Laurie Culbert has published 2 stories on these sales for the Vancouver Sun in the last week. I reached her by phone to discuss how these sales were arranged and in what ways they involve and impact Indigenous groups, the environment, local agriculture, and the potential BC has to build public amenities going forward. So would you mind just take a listen by telling our listeners who you are?
Sure. My name is Laurie Culbert. I'm a reporter with the Vancouver Sun and Province newspapers, and I've worked here for about 20 years.
Ooh, excellent. Thank you. So to get right into it, BC's Auditor General spent the last 2 years analyzing the provincial government's land sales program, which was called the Release of Assets for Economic Generation. It's now been renamed by our current government. But can you start out by giving our listeners a brief summary of her findings?
Yeah, so the Auditor General looked at the first 2 years of the program, which was 2013 to 2015, and she was very concerned about one particular sale involving some property sold in bulk in Coquitlam that's known as the Burke Mountain sale, because she found that by selling those properties in bulk, the provincial government shortchanged themselves by around $40 million because of not getting the best deal that they could get if the properties had been sold individually. And she also made a series of recommendations for improvement to just how this program was working with the selling off of public lands.
Right.
So basically, but she only looked at the first 2 years, and just so that your listeners understand, I mean, government has always bought and sold land. That's not new, but in 2013, the former Liberal government decided to really increase the sale of public land, particularly just to raise revenue. That was the sole focus, and so that's why we see between 2013 and around 2018 such a big increase in sales of public land. So I just decided to look at the all 6 years in total from 2013 to 2019 to try to get a sense of how many properties have been sold and, you know, the dollar figures involved and if taxpayers were well served by these sales.
Right. Do you have any sense of why it was in 2014 there was this drastic increase in surplus land sales?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the Liberals wanting to bring more revenue into the government to balance budgets and fund programs. And so, I mean, you could look at the title of the program. It's not a secret. It was intended clearly to generate revenue.
Right. Something I wanted to ask you about is Indigenous land rights. So the vast majority of BC is unceded, meaning the land has never been surrendered or given to our government. And you mentioned that the government has had to pay about $100 million in settling land claims with First Nations during these land sales. And in some cases, it seems like there's a legal obligation to sell this quote-unquote surplus land to First Nations first at market value. So could you tell our listeners exactly how Indigenous groups are factored into surplus land sales in BC?
Yeah, so what the Auditor General found when she looked at the first 2 years is that in almost 100% of the cases that she analyzed, there was something called an accommodation agreement that was reached with Indigenous groups, and basically that was if there was a government property being sold that fell within the territory of a certain Indigenous group, that it basically had two choices. It got a right of first refusal to buy the property. It would be a direct sale at roughly market value, so they wouldn't have to go through a bidding process. Or if they didn't want to own the land, and this was in the vast majority of cases, then they got something called an accommodation agreement, in which they were given a certain amount of money so that they would relinquish all claims to that land. So we know from the province that between 2013 and 2017 that those accommodation agreements added up to $82 million. They wouldn't or couldn't give me the amount paid in the last 2 years, so I conservatively estimated that it would now be at least $100 million, but it's likely more.
Right. So, sorry, just so I understand, so in most cases of these land sales, the First Nations whose land it belongs to were given first right of purchase?
Well, they would be given one of those two options. So they could, if they wanted to buy it, they were given that option. My understanding is every time, but in the vast majority of cases, my understanding is, and this is coming from the Auditor General, that there was a buyout that was given instead, because not all First Nations want to be involved in property development. So, but then we saw that there were definitely, the Willington lands, for example, and Burnaby, which is a big purchase that you saw there, two First Nations joining with a major developer to buy that land with plans to develop it.
Right. So Forest Lands and Natural Resources Operations has sold 33 lots, you report, including, for example, the Cheeky Fan area in Squamish, which is now slated for development. I'm just wondering, do you have a sense of the environmental impact of the lands lost in that sale and the others made?
I didn't delve too deeply into the environmental impact at all, but the one that you just raised in Squamish is one that likely is worth looking into for environmental impacts. I mean, there are so many side stories that could be looked into, with these land sales, and certainly environmental impact is absolutely one of them.
Yeah, I mean, it also had me thinking about, the current environmental crisis we're in, and how, a ton of municipal governments in BC have declared a climate emergency: Vancouver, Richmond, Port Moody, Sydney, etc., like quite a few. And so, of course, we have an agricultural land reserve to preserve arable land. But I'm just wondering, how much of this land that's been sold might also be arable and very necessary for us in the future as our climate changes.
So we know that, in fact, the NDP government, so most of these sales that we're talking about, these 164 sales, were started or finalized by the former Liberal government. The NDP, the current government, has been involved in a handful of ones in the last couple of years. One of the sales that the NDP has overseen is the sale of 142 acres in Surrey that are part of, that are zoned as agricultural land. The province sold that land to the city of Surrey. Now, I mean, the city of Surrey says they're going to maintain it as agricultural land, that it's part of their kind of eco plans, that it's going to be kept as parkland. I think it's a deal that we should keep an eye on. It's in a rapidly growing area of Surrey. At this point, we take both levels of government at their word, but that is 142 acres of agricultural land that is now exchanged hands.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. My parents live in Surrey, and it is crazy how much land is being sold, land that was ranch land or farmland. And yeah, very good point to keep an eye on that. So our current provincial government has rejigged this land sales program and renamed it Surplus Public Properties. So that means not only the name has changed, but the program has a greater focus on economic generation and cost savings, not just generating revenue as the previous government was doing. And as you report, 69 properties remain on the province's surplus list, though the NDP says it has no sales revenue targets for those lands. So I'm just wondering, what do you think the NDP has learned from the Liberals' time administering this land sales program as they go forward with these properties that are still on this surplus list?
So, I mean, what the current minister says is that the NDP government will consider whether a land deemed surplus could in fact be used in the future, to build a school, to build a hospital, to build affordable housing, that they'll keep all those things in mind before they will allow a sale to occur. So, that's laudable, and hopefully that continues to be the case. But we do know that this is a way to access very quick cash for governments. So I think it's important to continue to kind of watch these land sales and to make sure that is actually happening.
Yeah. And then you write in this piece from Saturday's Vancouver Sun that there's been similar land sales programs happening in Ontario and Alberta, and there's been some uproar in those provinces, some pushback. Can you elaborate on why it might be the case that less people are making noise about these quote-unquote surplus land sales here in BC?
Honestly, I just think it was such an obscure program, and very few people knew about it. Even when the Auditor General released her report, it was last July, and things get lost in the summertime. People are on vacation. They don't have as much time to be up on what's happening in the media. But I have to tell you, I've been doing this job for, as I said, about 20 years, and the response to these stories has been huge. There now appears to be a lot of public chat about this. People are upset about schools being sold. They're upset about hospital properties being sold. They're raising questions, and I have seen there's an uptick in social media for sure talking about these stories this week. So that may be changing here. I think one point to illustrate that is the Vancouver School Board, the former one, the one that was fired. They dug their heels in and refused to sell school properties several years ago to balance the budget, and ultimately that board was fired. And that is one example of a local government kind of saying no to the pressure to sell. But really, there wasn't a lot of attention being put on this in BC, as much as you saw going on in Ontario and Alberta recently.
Well, yeah, so you say there's been a bit of an uptick in people paying attention on social media, you've noticed, for example. Is that because of the reporting you've done, or have you seen other journalists also digging into this report?
Well, for sure, other journalists have done stories in the past. I just think it's happening this week. Just it's a bit of follow-up from what we've done, and CKNW and other stations picking up on it, and people tweeting things out. Their opinions of what's happening. I think it's all just happening this week.
Okay. And then I'm also wondering what role transparency plays in how much BCers are engaged in this surplus land sales. Has the government in the past made these sales clear and available for the public to know and understand?
I don't think so. And even this current government that seems more willing to be transparent, the information available online is really not helpful. There is one fairly hard to find website that lists the properties that have been sold, but sometimes the descriptions are very vague, so you don't know exactly what it is that's been sold. There are no prices attached. There are no buyers attached. There's no indication of what the future use of the property is going to be. There's no explanation for why it was declared surplus. I'm not convinced that there has been or is transparency here, and that is one of the things that the Auditor General said needed to be improved, so the public understood why our land is being sold, and if there's benefit to the taxpayer, what it is.
I have just one final question, which is from doing this really excellent reporting, what most stood out to you? Like, what did you most take away from this story?
I think that it might be around the whole transparency thing. I think we as residents and citizens of British Columbia just really need to be aware of what our government is doing. And sometimes it's not easy, especially if it's kind of an obscure program that no one's quite aware of. But if you're aware that your school board is selling schools, or you're aware that a hospital down the road from your house is now up for sale, it's probably just worthwhile asking your local MLA or emailing the province just to ask why those things are happening, because I think a lot of these sales happen in early days when the vast majority of us just had no clue what was happening.
Yeah.
And and obviously, it's an obvious statement, but it's worth saying. I mean, now that property's gone. Mm-hmm. So if we have a population growth, we need more schools, we need more hospitals. It's going to be increasingly more expensive for government to acquire land again for, future infrastructure that we're going to need to build.
Right, and especially considering our housing crisis and our environmental crisis.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that whole conversation around affordable housing, there are, on the flip side, the developers who have bought some of these properties are supposed to be building affordable housing, social housing in some cases, community amenities that will be helpful. But we need to see that that's actually going to get built. And unfortunately, there's been unsuccessful stories like Little Mountain, which is still sitting empty 10 years later, that would suggest that we have to make sure this affordable housing is actually going to get built.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your time, Lori. I very much appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and thanks for this excellent reporting. And this piece will air on the news show. Thank you for listening. This piece was reported and produced by myself, Alex DeBoer. Special thanks to Lori Culbert for her time and reporting. The song you heard was Gilros Noise Attack by Mantra Aspectra. All right, and we're back. Thanks for listening. You just heard an interview I did. My name is Alex DeBoer, and you're listening to Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM. We just heard an interview I did with a reporter from the Vancouver Sun named Lori Culbert, who's done some really excellent reporting on land sales by the provincial government in BC, really illuminating stuff. I would check out her work. She had a piece published in last Saturday's Vancouver Sun, and there was one midweek as well, which focused on the sale of schools primarily. So it's a really interesting topic because these are, of course, public lands, and also they are unceded lands, meaning they have not been given up, surrendered, or given by the various Indigenous nations in BC. So there's a lot of interesting detail in how they are sold and what the impacts of those sales are for us, as I got into in the interview a little bit, for Indigenous groups, for the environment, for agriculture, and all this in the context of municipalities in BC like Vancouver and Burnaby and other places, Surrey, being in a housing crisis and, needing land, and also us being in a climate crisis, which I didn't realize a ton of municipalities in BC have declared a climate crisis. So Vancouver, Burnaby, Port Moody, a bunch of places. So it's interesting to think about those things, and hopefully we're going to dig more into that because this was mostly an interview that was dissecting Lori's reporting, but I want to dig more into that, and I'm hoping to get a bit of the history for our next show on housing and how it's been built in BC since BC has existed, and how we've come to be at a place where we rely almost entirely on private developers to build housing for us, which is sort of a tangential piece of reporting to this piece. So that'll be coming later. But now we have some local headlines. We have News Collective comrade Armand Reyna wants to tell us about Bitcoins. What's up, Armand?
Yeah, so Mayor Kennedy Stewart has proposed a ban on Bitcoin ATMs in Vancouver in response to concerns raised by Vancouver police that they are the ideal money laundering vehicles. Vancouver actually hosted the first ever Bitcoin ATM, and there are currently 76
in the world, or the first ever Bitcoin ATM?
I think so. And there are currently 76 ATMs in use.
Oh.
And city staff are going to research into the ban and report back in the fourth quarter of 2019. However, some have raised concerns about how such a ban could impact the most marginalized, such as sex workers, because Bitcoin is often used by communities who are excluded from credit cards and those who require a certain degree of anonymity in their transactions.
That's very interesting. So you said city staff will report back in the fourth quarter of 2019 on that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
In other news, residents in the Greater Vancouver area are warned to expect air quality advisories in the next upcoming months.
Mm-hmm.
This has been heightened because of the drought conditions in BC that BC has been experiencing. And the BC Wildfire Service also reports that though the number of hectares lost to wildfires so far are below average, we're yet to commence the peak wildfire season from late July to August.
Speaking of concerns about climate change, today we stopped some folks around campus and asked them how they felt about the second approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Here's what they had to say.
Here we go.
Yesterday, June 19th, our federal government passed the second reapproval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which will transport 100 gallons of diluted bitumen from the Alberta oil sands to the BC coast every day. In response to environmental concerns, the federal cabinet and the National Energy Board are defending their decision by saying that the pipeline is in the national interest because it would contribute tens of billions of dollars to the Canadian economy and sustain thousands of jobs. Myself, Milena Carrasco, and Armand Reyna walked around UBC's campus to ask people for their thoughts.
We're from the local radio.
You're trying to what?
We're on an interview. What are your thoughts on the recent reapproval of the pipeline, the Kinder Morgan pipeline?
I've heard about it, but I haven't thought about it much. I mean, of course, it's probably bad for the environment, is what I think. But I don't really have strong thoughts about it because, I mean, to be hypocritical of me to do the things I'm doing and also be super caring about the environment at the same time, because I don't think I'm the most careful person when it comes to that kind of things. But yeah, I don't have a strong thought about that. So
Okay.
You have a show?
Do you have any thoughts on the second reapproval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline that was just passed?
Are you asking me from a Vancouver perspective or from if I as a Canadian?
Your perspective, whichever one aligns with.
I think they've done enough research on it to see the pros and cons and the alternatives, and we're still in an economy where I think, unfortunately, most of our vehicles are still running, and our planes and with fuel. So if it's not going to be done through the pipeline, it's going to be done another way, which might be equally as dangerous to transport. So I'm going to trust that the people who are making decisions are informed by the pros and the cons and the research behind it.
Awesome. Thank you. Are on the second reapproval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Are you okay with me asking you that and you sharing just your thoughts or feelings or anything on that?
Hey,
no?
how's it going?
It's all good. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Do you have any thoughts on the Kinder Morgan pipeline?
Not really time to share. Sorry, I'm late for class.
No worries.
We're from the local radio, wondering if you had any thoughts about the recent approval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline by Trudeau.
I don't know too much, to be honest, but from what I've heard, it goes something along the lines of how it got approved, but he's donating the funds to nature or something to do with the environment, which sounds a little bit ironic to me, knowing that the pipeline is kind of damaging the environment itself. But I guess that's all I know so far. Yeah.
I think I have fairly mixed feelings about it, actually. I definitely prefer that we move away from fossil fuel and the oil industry and move towards greener energy sources. However, at this point, I also feel that it might not be so realistic to completely go in that direction. So, yeah, those are my feelings. The thing is, you have to be mindful of what you're using in your daily life. It's similar to, say, you're saying you're a vegetarian, but you're wearing leather shoes, or you have animal products in your life. Similarly, if we're continuing to use oil industry products from Alberta and elsewhere, I think it's hard to be completely against a pipeline in our country.
I have like mixed feelings on it, because I'm more liberal than I'd say conservative, but I understand its necessity for economic growth, and it's something like 28% of Canada's future income potentially, if you include all the engineering costs. But I also think it's really bad for the environment, and I'm thoroughly against that side of it. The counter argument is to invest in green energy, but that's not a sustainable approach as well. So you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
I think it's part of what they call wicked problems, where there's not anything simple about it in any aspect. Every single part of it's complicated.
Yeah. It's interesting because the far left, or the left, is so anti it, or very much so against it, but their arguments are so weak against it as well. And I'm yet to see a viable alternative solution, even though I don't agree with the current one.
A complex problem. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much, guys.
My name is Yudel Huberman. I'm a fourth-year student in Natural Resources Conservation here at UBC.
Awesome. So one of the questions that we're asking people around the UBC campus today is about thoughts or feelings on the second reapproval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline that was passed yesterday by Justin Trudeau and his cabinet. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't envy Trudeau in his position. He is trying to pull together public opinion, the desires of different provinces. I do think it's the wrong decision. It just does not make sense to me at this point when we need to be moving away from fossil fuels, especially tar sands. Oil, to now be investing in new infrastructure, which should last for another 50 years or so. But I understand it's hard to get reelected in most of Canada on a position where you don't want any pipeline at all. And when he originally campaigned, it wasn't on a no pipeline platform. It was on maybe one of three, and so he's basically fulfilling his promise.
Okay, awesome.
Hey,
Thank you so
we're
much.
from CITR Radio. We just wanted a few questions about how you feel about the Trans Mountain pipeline.
Being approved for the second time?
On my birthday.
On your birthday?
Yeah, it was the worst birthday present ever. I feel like it's the most hypocritical move he possibly could have done right after declaring a climate emergency. And you can't say that you're going to fix a climate crisis problem by building a pipeline and increasing resource extraction and shipping in sensitive marine areas.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. You're listening to Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM. So we just heard a piece that was done by Milena and Armand, two News Collective members in studio with us now. And they went out on campus this afternoon to ask folks their thoughts on the newly reapproved Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. So I think that was really nice to hear what the average kind of people think. We, of course, this sample size or whatever is on a university. But I was actually surprised from hearing the tape you guys got that it was not super progressive. Like, I would say more people were in favor of it than not. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I felt like we got some pretty mixed answers, and by mix, I mean that everyone kind of saw two sides of the coin. They looked at it like the good and the bad. And so, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was that lady who was like pretty upset about it happening on her birthday.
Yeah, fair.
But I felt like for the most part, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of similar to that what that one guy said when he asked me, "Are you asking me as a Canadian or as a Vancouverite?"
Good point.
And so, or like how that one girl was, I don't know if we kept it in, but she was saying, it's just a really complex question. So it seemed like people were really kind of delving into like the different layers and aspects of what it is, instead of like, I feel like the narrative that I was expecting, or that most people would have been expecting, was no, like not at all, pipeline, no bueno.
No bueno. Yeah, and because we're on a university campus, which are generally places of more progressive thinking, more leaning towards the left, because of, at least within like liberal arts. But as a whole, it seemed like the sample you got was, mostly people trying to see both sides of it, or being conflicted in their opinion of whether it was good or bad. What do you think, Armand?
Yeah, I think another thing is that what surprised me was how so many people had not really heard about it or not really thought about it much.
Right. Yeah. So we didn't keep, of course, everything in. What percent would you say that was of the people you went up to?
Nearly half.
Yeah, I'm leaning towards like the 35% realm, 35 to 40. I don't know.
And again,
maybe
we should say, though, that there are a lot of people on UBC's campus that are not from here. Like, our international students might be visiting. So they, in their defense,
especially over the summer. So I don't know how
reflective. Yeah. So I don't know how reflective that is of like the Canadian population. Yeah. But still, kind of surprising.
Yeah. But yeah, it was really interesting to hear there are a lot of different takes, and as Milena said, people just trying to grapple with the issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was what one of the people you interviewed said, that kind of, well, if you are against this pipeline expansion and you're anti-fossil fuel extraction or anti-oil, then, well, I assume you won't be using any oil-based products, or you shouldn't, in order to make that line of thinking make sense. And I mean, that to me is really problematic. It's like, creating a society where you basically can't use basically most things we use are oil products, or a huge percentage, right? So to be like, well, it's like people who are like, oh, well, you're against the pipeline expansion? Well, then I hope you never drive a car, It's like, okay, well then, like, that's just ridiculous. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it seems like that kind of thinking is kind of counterproductive. It's like, how are we going to take, like, steps to, like, try to solve the problem if we're like, well, nope, it's not going to happen because... I mean, I think it's the same thing as saying, like, well, that's the way it's always been, because it really has been, and that's why most of our products and most of the things that we consume are made of are like oil-based products. Yeah. But we have to like start making big steps, I think, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. For example, like to think about even the possibility of not having this pipeline expansion, so that we can further, like transition into just living a more sustainable and environmentally friendly life.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like creating a society which functions based on fossil fuels, and then being like, oh, well, if you really oppose this, find a way to not live in this society and not use anything. It's pretty challenging. I would say, I don't know if anyone listened to the episode of Front Burner that came out a couple days ago, which is CBC's daily news podcast. But it was really interesting and depressing very depressing. Basically what they said is like the 3 strategies that Canada currently uses to deal with the climate crisis are carbon taxes, using renewable energy, so like biofuel and hydroelectricity as opposed to fossil fuel, and as opposed to things like coal and stuff, I think, which are really dirty. And there was one more. What was it? What's a third thing? I forget. There were 3 things, like three major prongs to achieve our Paris Climate Accord goals to keep warming below 2%, I believe. 1.5, is that it? Yeah. You're the expert, Max. And so say if and right now there's a lot of pushback provincially and nationally, well, a lot of pushback provincially, especially on, for example, carbon taxes. But even if we implemented all 3 of our most well thought out strategies in Canada, like to their fullest extent, we would still come short of the carbon emissions that we need to make, the reduction in carbon emissions that we need to make to meet the climate accord agreements. So then what they looked at is, okay, well, how else are we emitting carbon? Because those 3 things are mostly focused on the consumer, right? People fueling up their car, people heating their house. Those are the individual people. Then they looked at industry, and it's like 40% of our carbon emissions come from the fossil fuel industry, from oil extraction. So, I mean, the thing is that this idea that, individuals need to do more, we need to transition to greener energy sources, etc. I mean, the third thing was electric cars. The thing is, if we do even all of that, it's still not enough. So, I mean, I kind of think we're screwed, but that's just me. But, basically we need kind of like an overhaul of the whole system. So I don't know how you achieve that, like huge worldwide strikes. We need mass action, and we need like the very fabric of our society to change. So, that was just my 2 cents. Armand?
Well, yeah, one thing I found interesting, I think one of the people we spoke to highlighted it, was that we're investing, one of the pretexts is that we're investing in this pipeline so that we can get money to invest in clean tech, which seems kind of circular. Why couldn't we just invest in clean tech to begin with? So I think there is a lot of, and I think we did a piece a couple of weeks ago with George Benson where we spoke about a lot of the economic benefits of investing early in green technologies and green industries and phasing out these kind of fossil fuels and those kind of industries. And I think that's more of the way we should be thinking about this problem.
Good point.
I think like that exact conversation or that exact thing that you just said was actually something that like a conversation that happened between Prime Minister Trudeau and Elizabeth May, where Prime Minister Trudeau was pretty much saying, we have to make money now, i.e. buy the pipeline, so we can invest it, like you said, in green energy. And Elizabeth May was like, well, why don't we just invest in green energy and just, skip that whole first part. But I think it has, I don't know, I think that Trudeau was trying to say, we're going to make like a lot of money, and so we can use like all those resources from that money.
But I mean, yeah, and of course you need to make the money to have the money to invest. But what a lot of people would say in defense of the pipeline is, well, if we aren't shipping oil or diluted bitumen to market, someone else is going to bring that product to market, and that oil is going to be extracted in far less environmentally friendly and safe ways than it is in Canada with our higher environmental and safety regulations. So there's another counter argument, right? Because even like we talked about when you interviewed George Benson, Armand, it's like we can look at Canada as an individual country and our contributions to global climate change and carbon emissions. But if by us cutting off fossil fuel extraction or other carbon emitting processes means those processes move to places that are doing it in dirtier and worse conditions, then you know what I mean? Like, it's so complex. And I'm not in any way saying that means we shouldn't be challenging ourselves to move away from fossil fuel. I'm just saying that that's another part of it, right?
No, I totally get that. And it's like, I mean, in my eyes, I see it, well, they're both the same bad thing. It's just one bad thing is worse in another place. But, you know, still a bad, no, well, actually, that's totally subjective. I should say, in my opinion, it's a bad thing. But I don't know. It doesn't make it better. I mean, maybe, but it's still,
I don't know. Yeah, you could argue it does.
I guess.
I don't know.
I think also in the case of this particular pipeline, the quality of oil and the way it's being produced is in some ways worse than oil produced elsewhere in the world because of the environmental impact and because of the process by which you produce bitumen. It's different from, like, let's say in Saudi Arabia or other parts in the world, they have quite easy access to oil because they have such a large oil reserve. While we have to do a very complicated process to pump water underground and chemicals underground.
Yeah,
and then
a lot of wastewater. But would the alternative be the Middle East, or would it be like America?
Yeah, that's
you know what I mean? And then they're doing perhaps worse. It's all bad. I don't know. Yeah. But I have heard that argument.
And the other thing is about the money. I think we may not make that much money. It just depends on the oil prices, right? So currently the oil prices are up because there's some war with Iran. People are talking about that.
Yeah.
But a couple of years ago, the oil prices were down, and then a lot of the oil companies in Alberta were losing money because of that.
Right.
So it really just depends on
the market,
on the oil prices. While in terms of clean tech, it's quite clear that, you know, that market's just going to grow in the next 10, 20 years. So it's a really good opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Well, let's leave it there and go to a quick break. And then we have a conversation with our German comrade, Max. Hello, Max.
Hey.
Who's going to talk to us about Germany's new renter protections.
Berlin's
right?
Yeah.
Specifically, and how they compare with our renter situation here in Vancouver. So please stay tuned, and we will be back after this short break. You're listening to CITR 101.9 FM.
This band is really good, and I've been wanting to find out more about local music.
Yeah, I heard about it through CITR and Discorder.
What's that?
It's a radio station. You can review all the music that comes in and help out with touring bands or just do some data entry to get started in their music department.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, you can just email volunteer@citr.ca and they can help you get into the station or just come in whenever.
Well, I'll be there, so...
To understand more about fashion, we asked CITR student executive and fashion expert Jonathan Q what fashion means to him.
Like, it's just aesthetically something that's so ostentatious. Typically. I mean, because of course, I mean, it's also, you know, I mean, when you say fashion, I think people are talking explicitly about consumerism, as opposed to someone who buys like you know, let's say someone buys a
If you really want to know more about fashion, come on down to CITR in the Student Union building of UBC and pick up some of our merchandise à la mode. Nous avons t-shirts, sweatshirts, socks, and coffee mugs.
But it's also very aesthetically gripping.
To keep you styling in support of the station you love. Isn't that right, Jonathan?
Well, actually, is it? Because, I mean, you know, I was going to say because of the cultural vacuum that we exist within, but then, you know, really, fashion today is kind of derived from the European idea of couture, and that's been around for centuries.
Oh my gosh, Lauren, I have always wanted to be on the radio.
Christy, you know you can do that at CITR and Discorder, right?
What?
Yeah, you can get a show or help with live broadcasts and interview people at shows around the city and make ads and PSAs that play during the shows.
Wow.
Yeah, just email volunteer@citr.ca and they can help you get started or just come into the station whenever.
I will. Thank you.
Hey bro, I was kind of thinking that I might want to write like stuff for a magazine, dude.
You know you can do that at CITR and Discorder, right?
What?
Yeah, you can review live shows where you get in for free, or music and books and stuff that's coming out, or do write-ups on artists and local issues for Discorder magazine.
That's sick, bro.
Yeah, just email volunteer@citr.ca and they can help you get started, or just come into the station whenever.
Dude, I totally will.
And we're back.
Yeah, that's what people hear in Germany, right?
It's Germany
Yeah.
here on CITR 101.9 FM. You're listening to Democracy Watch. And Democracy Watch is reporting from Berlin. Not really. Just
not
kidding.
really.
Just kidding. But we do have a German here. Hey, Max, what's up?
Hey.
So Max has been looking into some new renter protections happening in Berlin, Germany. And since we, too, have renters in Vancouver and are in a constant crisis over housing and achieving any real renter rights, we thought we would make a little comparison and examine or zoom in on Berlin. So why don't you start us out, Max?
Yeah, especially because on last Tuesday, Vancouver Council voted unanimously to strengthen protections for the city's renters in Vancouver. And the changes called the Tenant Relocation and Protection Policy are meant to help renters find new homes if they are forced to move and increase the compensation to which they're entitled. And we did a piece on that on our previous show last week. You can listen to it on our podcast, Seeking Office, so you should check it out. Check that out as well. We got some news from Berlin. So Berlin's government has just agreed to freeze rents in the German capital for 5 years from 2020.
Yep.
I think that's a huge step forward because due to reforms of the German tenancy law, tenants in Berlin have had similar problems with renoviction than we have here in Metro Vancouver. Landlords were able to force through so-called energetic modernizations of their properties and pass down up to 11% of their costs to the tenants. So the law allows landlords to literally flush out old tenants and immediately put the flats on the market at a higher price without having made any significant improvements.
Wow.
Berlin city government agreed on Tuesday on the outlines of a draft law that would include a temporary freeze on rents for 5 years from 2020, with the bill to be drafted in October. This means protection against rent increases for 1.5 million apartments. The move was made by Berlin's coalition government of the center-left Social Democratic Party, which is the SPD, the Greens, and the far-left Linke Party.
Right.
Under the plan, landlords who seek to raise rates because of renovation work will also have to seek official approval for any increases above 50 cents per square meter. This is a huge step because you have to know that about 85% of Berlin's 3.4 million residents live in rentals.
Yeah,
so,
that's huge.
And
here it's like 53%, you said? Yeah.
Right.
In Vancouver, that is, yeah.
Yeah, so in Berlin it's because of condition fostered by the city's troubled history, Cold War, division, and 5 decades of communist rule in East Berlin.
Right.
So, and rents in Berlin have risen 75% in the last 5 years. A recent survey by the property consulting group Knight Frank showed that property prices in Berlin rose 21% in 2017, which is the steepest rate in its survey of 150 cities around the whole world and far above the average increase of 4.5%. If we look at the numbers of Vancouver, rental prices are expected to go up by an average of 7%, despite the provincial rent control caps is now in force. So that's the third steepest predicted rise in the country after Toronto, where rents are forecasted to increase 11% and 9% in Ottawa.
Right.
So, yeah.
So what are the reactions to this radical move? And what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, said that we must also provide an environment for people that want to build. And on the other side, the SPD, which is the junior coalition partner in Merkel's government, has pledged to implement such rent controls nationwide.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can they do that?
We will see. That would be nice, though. Yeah, we will see. But the influential property owners association called Haus und Grund, which means house and
What
ground.
does it mean?
Just
ground.
it's just house and ground.
What's
Yeah.
Grund? House and
Yeah.
ground.
So that's
their version of landlord BC.
kind of. Yeah, I guess. So they had urged members to raise rents by Monday night, so like one day prior the decision was made. So
really? Wow.
Yeah. So any increases in rent that will be made from now on need to be approved by the city of Berlin.
So was there a big push then for landlords to increase their rent?
Yeah,
Before this date, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think also in the last couple of weeks, a month, because this has been on the table for like a couple months.
But there were still rent controls in place, so they couldn't just up it like any amount, right?
Not any amount, but to add some like personal story to it, I also have a good friend who's living in Berlin since 5 years now, and he's received a letter a couple months ago from his landlord who wanted to increase the rent of his apartment by almost 50% because of increased costs in maintaining maintaining the building. So he had no other chance than moving into another apartment. So yeah, the recent move may come a bit late for him, but I think it is an important step to protect renters because much of what is coming on the market right now is just out of reach for low-income locals. So yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, Max, you're not from Berlin, but you study an hour out of the city.
Yeah.
Because Max is here for dear listeners on exchange, or is it exchange?
Yeah, kind of.
A sort of exchange where he's interning at CITR. But so you're near to Berlin when you're studying. Does Berlin have, it seems to me it has, but does it have a very strong kind of activist culture and sort of a strong culture of protest?
It has actually, yeah. And the thing is, Berlin is like the only state in Germany which has a coalition, like a kind of left coalition government. At the moment it's the SPD, the Greens, and the far left party. So that's the first state in Germany to really get such a radical thing up.
Right, such a left government.
So the CDU, which is the party of our like Chancellor Angela Merkel, is not really
She's not stoked about this.
Not really stoked about this. Unfortunately, this is like the only state in Germany which has such a left government, city government. So I'm not really sure we will see something like that in other states. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess it'll remain to be seen, right? Whether there's a sort of ripple effect. But yeah, I know Berlin certainly, like, every time I hear it come up, it's because people are moving there to become an artist or whatever. So it seems like there's a very strong artistic community and more kind of young people.
A lot of young people coming, artists, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but like 10 years ago, it was, like to rent an apartment was really easy, especially for people with low income, like artists and young people.
Right.
So but that really changed, as I said, in the last couple of years. So we just have to do something about that. And I mean, that may be radical, but I hope this will be like a good first step to just protect the renters.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to see if we can learn anything from this in our own city council here in Vancouver. Not sure if that's going to happen, but not sure if any councillors will take this to heart and inspiration, besides perhaps Jean Swanson. maybe Christine
We have
Boyle
to
as
ask her
well.
about that,
But
maybe. Yeah.
yeah, maybe we'll throw some questions at counselors about their thoughts on this radical move to protect renters in Berlin. But thanks for bringing this story to us, Max. That's your Democracy Watch for this week. We're ending a couple minutes early. Thank you very much for listening. We'll have more local news for you next week at 5. And check out our podcast Seeking Office if you haven't already done that.
You should.
You should, yeah. So we'll play you out with a bit of German dance music, and our German intern will be dancing in the studio.
Yeah, you can imagine it.
You can imagine it. Okay, thanks so much for listening. This is CITR 101.9 FM. Up next is the Spencer Latu Show, so please stay tuned.